The wind in the Scottish Highlands does not merely blow, it investigates. It pries into the cracks of window frames, slides under heavy oak doors, and seeks out the gaps in a man's layers of wool like a determined pickpocket. On this particular Tuesday in December, the wind was howling down from the Sutherland Mountains with a malice that suggested a personal vendetta against the village of Whodunit. Inside the police station, which was also his home, PC Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his favourite police activity, avoiding police work. The tall, gangling constable, with his mop of flaming red hair and hazel eyes that often drifted into a dreamlike state, was currently slumped in a battered armchair next to the pot-bellied stove. His dog, Lugs, a mongrel of indeterminate lineage and nervous disposition, was curled tightly around Hamish's ankles, acting as a living draft excluder. On the desk lay a formidable pile of paperwork from Strathbane headquarters. There were forms regarding sheep-dipping regulations, a census on firearm ownership, and a stern memo from Detective Chief Inspector Blair demanding an explanation for the excessive consumption of coffee and biscuits charged to the station's petty cash. Hamish looked at the pile. He looked at the stove. He looked at Lugs. "It is a terrible thing, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his voice a soft Highland lilt, when the bureaucracy of the land becomes heavier than the snow on the roof. Lugs let out a groan that sounded suspiciously like agreement. Hamish stood up, stretching his long frame. Instead of reaching for a pen, he reached for the percolator. He poured a mug of black coffee, the aroma battling the smell of damp wool and peat smoke that permeated the station. He had just raised the mug to his lips, anticipating the warmth, when the peace of the morning was shattered. It wasn't a crime, it was worse. It was a car engine, not the rattle of a local's rusted Land Rover, nor the chug of the post van. This was the purr of a high-performance engine, sleek and expensive. Hamish moved to the window, peering through the condensation. A silver Jaguar, gleaming offensively against the grey backdrop of the loch and the brooding mountains, had pulled up right outside the station gate. Oh, calamity, Hamish sighed. A Sassenach. The door of the Jaguar opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a brand-new tweed shooting jacket that had clearly never seen a gun, pristine green Wellington boots that had never touched mud, and a flat cap worn at a jaunty angle that suggested he thought he was posing for a magazine cover. He looked at the police station with a sneer that involved his entire face. Hamish considered locking the door and pretending to be out on patrol, but the man was already marching up the path, scattering gravel with an air of entitlement. The station door flew open, admitting a blast of freezing air and the stranger. "You!" the man barked, not bothering with a greeting. "Where is the constable? I was told this was the police station, though it looks more like a squatter's hut." Hamish took a slow sip of his coffee. He deliberately widened his eyes, adopting the expression of a simpleton who had just been asked to explain quantum physics. It was a look that had saved him from promotion for 10 years. "I am the constable, sir," Hamish said mildly. Hamish Macbeth. "And you would be—" "I am Sir Crispin Vane," the man announced, waiting for a reaction. When Hamish merely blinked, Vane huffed. "The conductor, the composer, Vane's Vesper choirs. Good God, man, do you not have a radio in this wilderness?" "We have a radio," Hamish said, scratching his ear. "But mostly it is for hearing about the sheep prices. What can I do for you, Sir Crispin? Have you lost your way?" "I never lose my way," Crispin snapped. He began to pace the small room, looking at the peeling paint with distaste. "I have bought the old majestic lodge on the North Ridge, Glencoe House. I intend to spend my Christmas here, soaking in the silence. I require absolute silence to finish my arrangement of In the Bleak Midwinter." "It is a quiet village," Hamish offered, "except when Rory at the hotel burns the toast." "It is not quiet." Crispin slammed a gloved hand onto Hamish's desk, sending the sheep-dipping forms sliding toward the floor. "I arrived last night, and what did I hear? Screeching, howling, some dreadful group of locals singing carols in the village hall. It sounded like a collection of dying cats being swung by their tails." Hamish suppressed a smile. The Whodunit choir was enthusiastic, certainly. Tuneful, perhaps less so. That would be the practice for the Christmas Eve service, sir. "Mrs. Wellington leads them." "Well, it must stop," Crispin declared. "I cannot work with that racket echoing up the glen. I want you to go down there and enforce a noise abatement order. Immediately." Hamish set his coffee down. His deceptive laziness was a shield, but underneath, he felt the familiar prickle of irritation that came with wealthy outsiders who treated the Highlands like a theme park that existed solely for their amusement. "I cannot do that, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping an octave, though remaining polite. "Singing carols is not a crime, even bad singing. And this is the Highlands. The sound carries. If you wanted silence, you perhaps should not have bought a house overlooking a village." Crispin's face turned a shade of red that clashed with his expensive tweed. "I was told the local police were helpful. I see I was misinformed. You are just like the rest of them. Lazy, obstructive peasants." He leaned in close to Hamish. He smelled of expensive cologne and brandy, despite the early hour. "Listen to me, Macbeth. I am a man of influence. I have friends in Edinburgh. I have friends in London. If that racket disrupts my composition one more time, I won't just file a complaint. I will have this station shut down and you sent to guard a car park in Glasgow. Do I make myself clear?" Hamish looked at the man. He noticed the tremor in Crispin's hands, nerves or perhaps withdrawal. He noticed the desperation in the man's eyes, hidden behind the arrogance. Sir Crispin Vane was a man under pressure, a man clinging to a fading career. "Crystal clear, sir," Hamish said softly. "Good." Crispin turned on his heel. "I expect results. I am hosting a private recital on Christmas Eve for a few select guests. If the village choir ruins the atmosphere, you will hear from my lawyers." With that, he stormed out. The Jaguar roared to life, spinning its wheels on the frost-hardened ground before tearing off toward the North Ridge. Hamish closed the door and shivered. He picked up his coffee, but it had gone cold. "Well, Lugs," Hamish said, looking down at the dog. "He is a charmer, is he not? A man who hates Christmas carols." Lugs yawned, unimpressed. Hamish walked to the window and watched the silver car disappear around the bend. He had a sinking feeling in his stomach. And it wasn't from hunger. In Whodunit, when a man with too much money and too much anger tried to silence the locals, it usually ended in one of two ways: a humiliating retreat or a wooden box. Hamish sighed and reached for his coat. He couldn't arrest the man for being rude, but he could go down to the Tommel Castle Hotel. He needed to see who else had arrived in the village, and more importantly, he heard the chef had made fresh scones. If trouble was coming to Whodunit, Hamish Macbeth intended to face it with a full stomach. Hamish threw his heavy police coat over his shoulders, the wool damp and smelling faintly of wet dog, and locked the station door with a decisive click. The prospect of fresh scones at the Tommel Castle Hotel was the only thing capable of dislodging the sour taste Sir Crispin Vane had left in his mouth. He trudged down the waterfront, head bowed against the biting wind, with Lugs trotting optimistically at his heels. The village of Whodunit was hunkered down, the grey stone cottages seeming to huddle together for warmth, their chimneys puffing white smoke into the leaden sky. When he pushed through the heavy oak doors of the hotel, the warmth of the lobby hit him like a physical embrace. Mr. Johnson, the hotel manager, was standing behind the reception desk, looking flustered and polishing a brass bell as if he were trying to erase it from existence. "Hamish," Johnson said, his voice tight. "Thank heavens. I was about to call you. That man, that Sir Crispin, he was here not 20 minutes ago, demanded to see the wine list, told me our vintage claret was vinegar suitable only for pickling eggs, and then stormed out toward the village hall. He said he was going to put a stop to the wailing once and for all. He is a man of strong opinions," Hamish said, leaning his elbows on the desk. "But I am here for something more important. Has the chef made the fruit scones yet?" Johnson sighed, the tension in his shoulders dropping an inch. "He has. Fresh out of the oven. Go through to the kitchen. If I let you eat in the dining room looking like that, the guests will think we've been raided." Hamish grinned, a slow, boyish expression that transformed his face, and made his way to the kitchen. He had just secured a large, steaming scone and was slathering it with an indulgent amount of clotted cream when the scream cut through the air. It wasn't the wind this time. It was a high, terrified shriek that echoed off the stone walls of the village, vibrating through the hotel kitchen's window. Hamish froze, the scone halfway to his mouth. He closed his eyes briefly, a look of profound suffering crossing his face. "Cannot a man eat a simple pastry in peace?" he whispered to the ceiling. He dropped the scone back onto the plate, a tragic loss, and bolted out the back door, Lugs barking excitedly. The scream had come from the direction of the village hall, a corrugated iron structure painted a depressing shade of green, sitting just 50 yards down the road. Hamish didn't run with the athletic sprint of a city cop. He moved with a loping, deceptively fast stride, like a wolf covering ground. He reached the double doors of the hall and threw them open. Inside, the air was freezing. The heating had evidently not been turned on. Standing near the small stage was Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife and formidable leader of the choir. She was clutching her chest, her face the colour of parchment. "Hamish!" she gasped, pointing a trembling finger toward the stage. "Look! Oh, look at what they've done!" Hamish moved past her, his hand instinctively dropping to the truncheon at his belt. Though he knew it was likely too late for weapons, he climbed the 3 wooden steps to the stage. There, lying beneath the grand piano that took up most of the space, was Sir Crispin Vane. The conductor was on his back, his arms spread wide as if he were finishing a particularly dramatic symphony. But his eyes were staring sightlessly at the rafters, and his face was twisted in a rictus of shock. The pristine tweed jacket was no longer pristine. A heavy iron bass music stand had been brought down with savage force upon his skull. But it was the final indignity that made Hamish pause. Stuffed firmly into the dead man's mouth, crumpled and wet, was a sheet of paper. Hamish leaned closer, tilting his head to read the text on the protruding edge. It was the sheet music for In the Bleak Midwinter. "Well," Hamish murmured, pulling a pair of gloves from his pocket. He got his silence right enough. He looked around the stage. No footprints on the dusty floorboards other than Vane's and Mrs. Wellington's. No sign of a struggle. Whoever had done this had walked up to the arrogant man, perhaps while he was ranting, and struck him down with the nearest heavy object. "Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, turning back to the terrified woman, his voice gentle but firm, "did you see anyone leaving? Anyone at—" "All?" "No one, Hamish," she sobbed. "I came early to set up the chairs. The door was unlocked. I walked in and found him like that." Hamish sighed. He looked down at Luggs, who was sniffing interestedly at the leg of the piano. "Leave it, Luggs," he commanded softly. He knew what came next. He would have to secure the scene. He would have to call headquarters. And that meant the end of his autonomy. Within the hour, the quiet of Whodunit would be shattered not by carols, but by sirens, flashing lights, and the inevitable, thundering arrival of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Hamish looked at the dead body of the man who had threatened to have him sent to Glasgow. He felt no triumph, only a weary resignation. The scone was definitely cold by now. "Go to the hotel, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said. "Tell Mr. Johnson to give you a brandy. Put it on the police tab." He paused, scratching his nose. "And tell him to save my scone." Hamish waited. Time in the Highlands usually moved at the pace of a drifting cloud, but waiting for the Strathbane police made it feel as though the clocks themselves had gone on strike. He sat on a folding chair near the door, guarding the scene, while the dead eyes of Sir Crispin Vane stared indignantly at the water-stained ceiling. The silence of the hall was heavy, broken only by the scratching of Luggs, who was methodically investigating a flea behind his left ear. Hamish shivered. The heating was still off, and the damp chill of the stone floor was seeping through the soles of his boots. He looked at the body again. The sheet music stuffed in the mouth was a message, of course. It was personal. It screamed of hatred, of a breaking point reached. It wasn't the work of a passing tramp or a burglar surprised in the act. But trying to explain the subtleties of human emotion to Detective Chief Inspector Blair was like trying to explain the concept of mercy to a crocodile. Then he heard them. It began as a distant wail, rising and falling on. The wind, disturbing the seagulls wheeling over the loch. The sound grew louder, aggressive and intrusive, shattering the peace of the village. Brakes screeched outside, followed by the heavy thud of car doors slamming. Hamish stood up, straightening his uniform cap, and sighed. The circus had come to town. The double doors of the village hall banged open, hitting the walls with a violence that made the dust motes dance. In marched Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man who seemed to carry his own personal storm cloud. He was a short, barrel-shaped man with a face the colour of a boiled ham, permanently flushed with high blood pressure and low temper. He was flanked by his usual shadows, Detective Sergeant Anderson and Detective Constable Macnab, both looking grim and self-important in ill-fitting suits. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Don't tell me you've touched anything. If I find one of your ginger hairs on the corpse, I'll have you up on disciplinary charges so fast your head will spin." "I have touched nothing, sir," Hamish said calmly, his hands clasped behind his back. "I secured the scene and waited for your expert guidance." Blair narrowed his piggy eyes, suspicious of the compliment, but unable to find a flaw in it. He marched up the steps to the stage, his heavy breathing audible even from where Hamish stood. He loomed over the body of Sir Crispin Vane, staring down with an expression of distaste that had less to do with the tragedy of death and more to do with the inconvenience of it occurring in his district. Nasty business, Blair grunted. He prodded the iron music stand with the toe of his shoe, blunt force trauma. Obvious. Probably some junkie from the city drifted up here looking for something to steal. Vane caught him, and wham. "With respect, sir," Hamish ventured, stepping closer but keeping a safe distance from Blair's swinging arms. "It seems unlikely to be a robbery. Sir Crispin is wearing a gold Rolex. And I can see the outline of his wallet in his jacket pocket. And there is the matter of the paper in his mouth." Blair bent down, squinting at the sheet music. Paper? Probably just fell in there during the struggle. Or he was eating it. "Eating sheet music, sir?" Hamish asked, keeping his face perfectly blank. He was a musician, but I do not believe they consume their work literally. "Don't get smart with me, Macbeth." Blair straightened up, his face darkening to a dangerous purple. "It's a taunt. Gang-related. Some sort of initiation ritual. I've seen it in Glasgow. This reeks of organised crime." Hamish looked at the dead conductor, dressed like a parody of a country squire killed in a drafty village hall in the middle of nowhere. The idea of organised crime syndicates targeting a washed-up composer in Whodunit was so ludicrous that Hamish had to bite the inside of his cheek to stop from laughing. "Perhaps, sir," Hamish said. Or perhaps it was someone who just didn't like his singing. He had upset a fair few people since he arrived yesterday. "Gossip." Blair spat the word out like a piece of gristle. "That's all you are good for, Macbeth. Gossiping with old biddies over tea. I'm talking about forensics. Hard evidence. Anderson. MacNab. Get the scene of crime boys in here, dust everything. I want prints on that stand. And get that paper bagged." Blair turned back to Hamish, jabbing a thick finger into the constable's chest. "As for you, get out of my sight. You're compromising the integrity of the crime scene just by breathing in it. Go and stand by the road. Direct traffic. Make sure no rubberneckers get near the hall. If a single reporter gets past you, you'll be walking the beat in the Gaubles by Monday." "Directing traffic, sir." "Right away," Hamish said. "And Beth," Blair shouted as Hamish turned to leave. "Sir." "Get that mangy rug of a dog out of here before I have it put down as a health hazard." Hamish bristled. He could take insults to himself all day. It was water off a duck's back. But insults to lugs were a different matter. He whistled sharply, and Lugs, who'd been considering lifting his leg against the DCI's car tyre outside, trotted faithfully to his side. "Come along, Lugs," Hamish whispered as they exited into the biting wind. "The great detective has arrived. We must not let our incompetence get in the way of his genius." He walked to the edge of the road, pulling his collar up. The rain was starting now, icy needles stinging his face. He watched as the forensic team arrived in their white vans, looking like spacemen descending on the quiet village. Blair was wrong, of course. He was spectacularly, aggressively wrong. This wasn't a gang hit or a robbery. It was a crime of passion, a crime of the village. And while Blair hunted for non-existent syndicates, Hamish knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't going to direct traffic. There was barely any traffic to direct. He was going to find out who had hated Sir Crispin Vane enough to silence him forever. But first, he needed fuel. The thought of the abandoned scone at the hotel returned to him with the force of a revelation. He glanced back at the hall, saw Blair shouting at a photographer, and slipped quietly away toward the harbour, melting into the grey landscape like a ghost. The kitchen of the Tommel Castle Hotel was a sanctuary of warmth and steam, a stark and welcome contrast to the freezing, sterile atmosphere of the village hall. Chef Pierre, a man whose temper was notoriously as fiery as his sauces, was furiously chopping onions at the centre island. Tears were streaming down his face, though Hamish suspected these tears were less about the pungent vegetables and more about the residual stress of serving Sir Crispin Vane. Mr. Johnson was leaning heavily against the counter, looking as though he had just gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight boxer and lost on points. He brightened visibly when he saw the constable, or, more accurately, when he saw that the constable was not accompanied by the shouting, red-faced man from Strathbane. Hamish sat on a high wooden stool, his long legs tucking neatly underneath, and accepted the plate that was wordlessly slid toward him. The scone was still warm, a golden crumbling masterpiece topped with a generous dollop of cream and strawberry jam. He took a bite, closing his eyes in a moment of pure, unadulterated bliss. For a few seconds, the murder, the shouting DCI blare, and the howling wind outside ceased to exist. There was only the scone. "He is dead, then?" Johnson asked, his voice low, glancing nervously toward the swinging doors, as if expecting Blair to burst through them. "Aye," Hamish said, wiping a crumb from his chin. "Hit with a music stand, a heavy one." "I cannot say I am surprised," Johnson admitted, pouring himself a sherry. "The man was poison, Hamish, pure poison. He arrived yesterday, and within an hour he had reduced the chambermaid, young Mary, to tears because the sheets were too abrasive. He told Pierre the soup tasted like dishwater. Pierre slammed his knife down, muttering something in French that Hamish was glad he didn't understand, though the sentiment was clearly violent. "Did he have any visitors?" Hamish asked, his tone casual, as if he were asking about the weather. "Besides the choir practice?" "Funny you should ask," Johnson said, lowering his voice further. "Last night, late, after midnight, I was locking up the front desk when I heard the bell. I went to the door, and there was a woman standing there, wrapped up in a heavy coat, scarf over her face. She asked for Vane's room number. I told her the guest was sleeping, but she insisted. Said she was an old friend." "Did you recognize her?" Hamish asked, pausing with the scone halfway to his mouth. "No. She kept her face hidden. But she was local, Hamish, I could tell by the voice. She went up, and about 10 minutes later I heard shouting. Vane's voice. He was laughing. Actually, a cruel, mocking sort of laugh. Then she came running down the stairs and out into the night. She was crying." Hamish chewed slowly, digesting this information along with the pastry. A local woman crying while Vane laughed. It suggested a history, a connection that went deeper than just noise complaints. He finished the scone, thanked Johnson, and slid off the stool. It was time to move. He exited through the kitchen door, lugs falling into step beside him. The rain had eased to a steady, soaking drizzle. Hamish turned up his collar and made his way along the waterfront to Patel's general store. The shop was the nerve centre of Whodunit, the place where news travelled faster than fibre-optic cables. The bell above the door jingled, and the smell of spices and damp newsprint greeted him. Mrs. Patel was behind the counter, sorting through a stack of magazines. She looked up, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent. "I have a quarter of sherbet lemons for you, Hamish," she said before he could speak, placing a small paper bag on the counter. "And I know why you are here. The whole village knows Blair is here. We heard the siren from 3 miles away." "He is a loud man," Hamish agreed, taking a sweet. "He thinks it is a gang from Glasgow." Mrs. Patel snorted. "Gang? Rubbish. It was one of us, wasn't it? That man Vane was in here this morning. He was buying stamps, or trying to. He got into a terrible row with Archie McLean." "Archie?" Hamish's ears pricked up. Archie McLean was a poacher, a dreamer, and a man who held grudges like family heirlooms. "What about?" "Vane told Archie he was going to fence off the North Ridge," Mrs. Patel whispered. "He said he didn't want filthy peasants wandering near his property. Archie told him that path has been a right-of-way since the Jacobites. Vane just laughed at him, called him a trespassing relic. Archie was shaking with rage when he left Hamish. He said Vane wouldn't live to see Christmas." Hamish sighed. "Archie said a lot of things when he was angry, but murder was a steep step up from poaching salmon. Still, it was a lead. Between a crying woman and a furious poacher, the list of people who wanted Vane silenced was growing rapidly. "Keep the change, Mrs. Patel," Hamish said, placing a coin on the counter. "And if Blair comes in, tell him I went to direct traffic at the crossroads." "He wouldn't believe you, Hamish." She smiled. "He knows you too well." "Aye," Hamish muttered, opening the door and stepping back into the grey afternoon. "But he doesn't know Whodunit, and that is where he will fail." The rain had thickened into a relentless icy curtain that blurred the edges of the landscape, turning the majestic mountains into brooding, shapeless hulks. Hamish Macbeth sat in his police Land Rover, the engine idling with a rhythmic rattle that sounded like a bag of spanners in a tumble dryer. He stared through the sweeping wiper blades, his mind churning over the information Mrs. Patel had provided. A crying woman, a laughing man, a poacher with a grudge. It was a messy tapestry, and he needed a thread to pull it all together. He put the vehicle into gear and drove slowly up the winding track toward the Tommel Castle Hotel. He had already visited the kitchen, but now he needed to enter through the front door, not as a hungry local seeking a scone, but as a man in need of insight that only the upper class could provide. The hotel lobby was a sanctuary of polished wood, tartan carpets, and the faint, expensive scent of beeswax and old money. Standing by a large vase of winter lilies, arranging them with surgical precision, was Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was, as always, impeccably dressed in a cashmere sweater the colour of soft heather and a skirt that was sensible yet undeniably elegant. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, a stark contrast to Hamish's wind-blown red mop. She looked up as he entered, her blue eyes cooling slightly as they landed on his dishevelled uniform. She said, her voice carrying that clipped, efficient tone that simultaneously terrified and enchanted him. "I assume you are hiding from that dreadful man Blair?" His shouting is audible from the car park. "I am merely conducting inquiries, Priscilla," Hamish said, removing his cap and running a hand through his damp hair. "Strategic positioning, you might call it. Mooching," she corrected, though a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Come into the office. I've just had tea brought up, and you look like a drowned rat." Hamish followed her into the small, warm office behind the reception desk. He accepted a cup of Earl Grey, which he privately considered to be hot water that had merely been introduced, to a tea bag, and settled into a leather armchair. He watched her pour her own cup, his heart doing that familiar, treacherous flip. He knew he was punching above his weight, a village copper pining for the daughter of a wealthy hotelier, yet he couldn't help himself. "You knew him, didn't you?" Hamish asked quietly, abandoning the pretense of casual conversation. "Sir Crispin Vane, you move in those circles." Priscilla sighed, sitting opposite him. She took a sip of tea, her expression hardening. "I knew of him, Hamish. Everyone in London did, though few would admit it publicly these days. He was a social pariah disguised as a genius." "How so?" "He was bankrupt," she said bluntly. "Gambling debts, mostly. But it was more than that. He had a reputation for mentorship. He would find young, talented sopranos from the provinces, promise them the world, solo recitals, recording contracts, and take them under his wing." Hamish sat up straighter, the lethargy dropping from him like a cloak. "And let me guess," he said darkly. "The wing came with conditions." "Precisely." Priscilla nodded. "He was a predator, Hamish. He used his influence to prey on naive young women. When they refused him, or when he grew bored, he would destroy their confidence. He'd tell them they were tone-deaf, ensure they were blacklisted from choirs. He broke people for sport." Hamish stared into his tea, the pieces of the puzzle shifting, clicking into a new and uglier pattern. The noise complaint about the carols hadn't been about musical perfection. It had been about control. It had been about silencing someone specific. "Did he have any connections here?" Hamish asked. "In Whodunit?" Priscilla hesitated, her finger tracing the rim of her cup. "I wasn't sure until you walked in. I saw the guest list. Vane didn't just book Glencoe House randomly. He was here because he heard a recording. Mrs. Wellington sent a tape of the choir to the BBC for a competition last month. Vane was one of the preliminary judges." "So he came here chasing a voice? Or chasing a victim?" Priscilla corrected. "Hamish, there is a girl in the choir. The soloist. Jenny Campbell. She's the grocer's niece, isn't she? She spent a year in London at the Royal Academy before coming back suddenly. She never said why." Hamish felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Jenny Campbell, a quiet, fragile girl with a voice like an angel, who had returned to the village a year ago, pale and withdrawn. "You think Vane was the reason she came back?" "I think Vane destroyed her in London," Priscilla said softly. "And when he heard her voice on that tape, he realised she was here. He didn't come for silence, Hamish. He came to finish what he started. He was likely tormenting her." Hamish stood up, the tea forgotten. The romantic tension that usually filled the room when he was with Priscilla had been replaced by a shared, grim understanding of the darkness that had invaded their village. "That explains the crying woman Johnson saw," Hamish murmured, "and it gives a very strong motive to a lot of people." "Hamish," Priscilla warned, standing up as well. "Be careful. Blair is arresting Archie McLean. I saw the police car heading toward Archie's cottage 10 minutes ago. If you're going to prove he's wrong, you need to be fast, and you need to be cleverer than you look." "That shouldn't be difficult." Hamish gave a wry smile, placing his cap back on his head. "Thank you, Priscilla." He turned to the door but paused. "And Priscilla? That colour suits you." Before she could reply, he was gone, striding back out into the rain. He had a direction now. Blair was chasing the loud, obvious suspect, the poacher, who had shouted threats in public. But Hamish knew the truth lay in the quiet, broken spaces of the village, in the secrets of a girl who had fled London to escape a monster, only for the monster to follow her home. He whistled for Luggs, who was sheltering under the Land Rover, and jumped into the driver's seat. He had to get to Archie's cottage, not to arrest him, but to stop Blair from closing the case before the real truth could be sung. The road to Archie McLean's cottage was less a road and more a suggestion of a path that had been reluctantly conceded by the heather. The Land Rover bounced and shuddered over the potholes, its suspension groaning in protest, mirroring the growing sense of unease in Hamish's chest. The rain was coming down in sheets now, sweeping across the glen in grey curtains that obscured the horizon, turning the world into a claustrophobic box of water and stone. Luggs whined from the passenger seat, sensing the tension, his wet nose pressed against the foggy glass. As Hamish rounded the final bend, the scene that greeted him confirmed his worst fears. Archie's cottage, a tumble-down affair of stone and slate that looked as if it had grown out of the hillside rather than been built upon it, was surrounded. 2 marked police cars from Strathbane were parked haphazardly in the mud, their blue lights flashing unnecessarily in the gloom, illuminating the terrified sheep in the adjacent pen with strobe-like pulses of azure. Hamish pulled up behind the convoy and stepped out into the deluge. The scene by the cottage door was chaotic. Detective Chief Inspector Blair was standing under the dripping eaves, looking like a triumphant toad, while Detective Sergeant Anderson and Constable MacNab were wrestling a handcuffed Archie McLean out the door. Archie was kicking and shouting, his voice raw with a mixture of fury and indignation. "Get your hands off me, you city filth!" Archie roared, twisting his shoulder away from Anderson's grip. "I haven't done anything. I was here all day. Save it for the station, McLean," Blair sneered, stepping forward to get into Archie's face. "We found the threats. We have witnesses who heard you say Vane wouldn't live to see Christmas. And now Vane is dead. You're coming with us for murder." "Murder?" Archie spat, his eyes wild. "I wouldn't murder a man for being a rude Sassenach. I'd just let his tyres down. This is a stitch-up." Hamish walked slowly toward the group, his hands deep in his pockets, his posture deliberately unthreatening. He stopped a few feet away, ignoring Blair's glare. He looked at Archie. The poacher was dressed in his usual attire, a filth-encrusted jumper that had once been green, trousers held up with baling twine and heavy work boots. But it was Archie's hands that caught Hamish's attention. They were black, not just dirty, but stained deep into the pores with thick, viscous axle grease. A wrench was lying in the mud near the door, also coated in the black substance. "Good afternoon, sir," Hamish said to Blair, his voice mild enough to be mistaken for boredom. "I see you have solved the case in record time. Strathbane will be throwing you a parade." Blair puffed out his chest, mistaking the sarcasm for deference. "Damn right I have, Macbeth. Open and shut. Motive, opportunity, and a violent history. The man is a menace." "Aye, he is that," Hamish agreed, nodding at Archie, who had stopped struggling to stare at the constable. "But I was wondering, sir, did you bag the evidence from the victim's mouth? The sheet music?" "Of course I did," Blair snapped. "It's in the evidence van. What of it? And was it clean?" Hamish asked softly. "It was covered in spit, obviously," Blair grimaced. "But otherwise, yes. Why?" Hamish gestured vaguely toward Archie's hands. "Archie, have you been working on the Land Rover again?" "Since 6 this morning," Archie shouted. "The differential went. I've been up to my elbows in grease all day. I haven't even stopped for a cup of tea." Hamish turned back to Blair. "You see the problem, sir? That grease is axle grease. It doesn't wash off with water. You need Swarfega and a scrubbing brush, and even then it takes days to fade. If Archie here had shoved that paper into Sir Crispin's mouth, the sheet music would be covered in black handprints. It would be ruined. But the paper you found was white." Blair froze. He looked at Archie's blackened hands, then at the wrench in the mud, and finally at Hamish. The rain drummed against the roof of the police car, filling the silence that stretched taut between them. For a moment, doubt flickered in the DCI's piggy eyes, followed immediately by a surge of defensive rage. He couldn't be seen to be wrong, not in front of his subordinates, and certainly not in front of Hamish Macbeth. He could have worn gloves, Blair barked, grasping at straws. Archie MacLean owns one pair of gloves, sir, Hamish said, and they are fingerless wool. He uses them for fishing. They wouldn't stop the grease. Enough! Blair shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. I'm not interested in your amateur theatrics, Macbeth. The forensic lab can worry about the grease. Right now I have a suspect who threatened the victim hours before death. Put him in the car! Anderson and MacNab shoved Archie toward the back seat of the cruiser. As he was bundled in, Archie locked eyes with Hamish. The panic was gone, replaced by a desperate plea. He knew, and Hamish knew, that once he was in the system in Strathbane, the truth would be buried under paperwork and Blair's ego. Don't worry, Archie, Hamish murmured, though the wind snatched the words away. I'll feed your dog. Hamish watched as the convoy tore away, tyres spinning in the mud, spraying filth over his boots. He was alone again in the rain, with only lugs and the desolate cottage for company. Blair had his man, which meant the pressure was off the investigation for a few hours. The DCI would be busy processing Archie, drinking whiskey in the Strathbane station, and writing his press release. But Hamish knew better. The grease was the key. The killer had clean hands, physically at least, and that meant the killer wasn't a rough-edged poacher living on the fringes. The killer was someone who could walk into a village hall without looking out of place, someone who could get close to Vane without him raising the alarm. Hamish turned back to his Land Rover. The image of Priscilla's worried face and the story of the broken soprano returned to him. The timeline was tight. Blair would realise his mistake eventually, or worse, manufacture evidence to cover it up. Hamish had to find the real killer before Archie MacLean was charged. He put the vehicle in gear and turned it around, heading back toward the village. He needed to find Jenny Campbell, and he needed to do it before the darkness of the afternoon turned into the total black of night. The wind howled louder, sounding less like an investigation now and more like a warning. The windshield wipers of the Land Rover fought a losing battle against the deluge as Hamish Macbeth navigated the vehicle back toward the village proper. The rhythmic thwack squeak of the rubber blades was hypnotic, a metronome counting down the time he had left before Archie MacLean was formally charged, and the truth was lost forever in the bureaucratic machinery of Strathbane. Hamish steered with one hand, the other resting absently on Lugs's head, his mind replaying the image of the grease-stained wrench lying in the mud. He pulled up outside a small whitewashed cottage on the edge of the loch, where a single light burned in the upstairs window. This was the home of Jenny Campbell's aunt, a kindly woman known for her excellent shortbread and her inability to keep a secret for more than 12 minutes. Hamish hoped, for once, that the latter trait would prove useful. He stepped out into the rain, hunched his shoulders against the gale, and knocked softly on the door. It was opened almost immediately by Jenny herself. She looked smaller than Hamish remembered, her frame slight and trembling in an oversized wool cardigan. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her face was pale, devoid of the makeup she had worn since returning from London. "Hamish," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I heard about Archie. Is it true? Did he—" "May I come in, Jenny?" Hamish asked gently, removing his dripping cap. "It is not a night for standing on the doorstep, and Lugs is complaining about the damp." She stepped back, allowing him into the narrow hallway. The air inside smelled of lavender polish and damp coats. She led him into the small sitting room where a coal fire was struggling to ward off the chill. Hamish sat in the armchair nearest the heat, while Jenny perched on the edge of the sofa, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. "Archie did not do it, Jenny," Hamish said quietly, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "He has grease on his hands that would have stained the evidence. But the police have him, and unless I find the truth, he will go to prison for a very long time." Jenny let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. "It's my fault," she choked out. "Everything is my fault. I brought that man here." "Sir Crispin?" Hamish asked. "Priscilla told me he knew you in London. She said he was cruel." Jenny looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and ancient humiliation. "Cruel doesn't cover it, Hamish. He was a monster. He didn't just critique you, he dismantled you. He found the one thing you were insecure about, and he hammered at it until you broke. In London he told me I had the voice of a strangled cat, that I was a peasant trying to act like a lady. He made sure I was fired from the chorus. And when he came here?" Hamish prompted, his voice low and soothing. "He cornered me," she whispered. "Yesterday, Outside. The rehearsal. He laughed when he saw me. He said he was amazed I still had the gall to sing in public. He told me—" She hesitated, fresh tears spilling over. "He told me that if I sang the solo on Christmas Eve, he would stand up in the audience and tell everyone exactly what I had done to get my scholarship in the first place. Lying filthy things, Hamish, but he said he had proof. He was going to ruin me in front of my family, in front of the whole village." Hamish felt a cold anger simmering in his gut. This was the motive he had been searching for, not a noise complaint, not a boundary dispute, but the sadistic destruction of a reputation in a village where reputation was everything. "Who knew about this, Jenny?" Hamish asked, leaning forward. "Did you tell anyone? Your aunt? Archie?" "No, not Archie." She shook her head vigorously. "I didn't want him to do anything stupid. I was terrified. I ran into the church after Vane left me. I was hysterical. I thought my life was over." "And?" "Mrs. Wellington was there," Jenny said softly. "She was arranging the flowers for Sunday. She saw I was upset. She made me sit down, made me drink water. I told her everything, Hamish. I told her what Vane was going to do. I told her he was going to destroy the concert, that he was going to turn the Christmas Eve service into a scandal." Hamish sat back, the leather of the chair creaking. The pieces of the puzzle, previously scattered and jagged, suddenly slid together to form a picture that was both tragic and terrifyingly clear. Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, the woman who regarded the church choir not just as a hobby, but as her personal fiefdom, her contribution to the divine order of things. She was a woman of fierce, protective pride. To her, the Christmas Eve service was the highlight of the social calendar, a sacred event that she curated with iron discipline. "What did she say, Jenny?" Hamish asked, his voice very quiet. "She went very still," Jenny recalled, staring into the fire. "She didn't shout. She just patted my hand and said, 'Do not worry, child. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but sometimes he needs a helping hand. No one will disrupt my service. No one.'" Hamish closed his eyes briefly. He could see it now. Mrs. Wellington arriving early at the hall to set up chairs, finding Vane there, perhaps mocking the setup, perhaps repeating his threats. The iron music stand, heavy and near at hand, the blow struck not for money, nor for hate, but for the preservation of order, for the sanctity of the village choir, and the sheet music, in the bleak midwinter, stuffed into the mouth. It wasn't a gang sign, it was a librarian's rebuke. "Be silent." "Thank you, Jenny," Hamish said, standing up. He felt a heavy sadness settling on his shoulders. He liked Mrs. Wellington. She made excellent chutneys and always asked after his health. But murder was murder, even when committed with the best of intentions. "Hamish?" Jenny asked, looking up at him fearfully. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to get Archie out of jail," Hamish said, putting his cap back on. "And I am going to attend a choir practice." He walked out into the rain, lugs trotting silently beside him. The motive wasn't the dark, organised crime Blair imagined. It was petty, human, and heartbreakingly parochial. It was the fear of social embarrassment, the fierce protection of a village tradition against an outsider who sought to mock it. Vane had threatened the one thing Mrs. Wellington valued above all else, the perfection of her Christmas Eve. Hamish climbed into the Land Rover. He knew who, and he knew why. Now came the difficult part. He couldn't just arrest Mrs. Wellington. She was a pillar of the community, and without proof, Blair would laugh him out of the station. He needed a confession. He needed to set a trap that would force the truth out into the open, using the very thing the killer was trying to protect, the music itself. The windscreen of the Land Rover was now a blurred mosaic of rain and darkness as Hamish steered the rattling vehicle away from Jenny Campbell's cottage. His heart was heavy, a familiar weight that settled in his chest whenever the hunt for a killer turned towards someone he knew, someone who had poured his tea and asked after his sheep. But the image of Archie McLean, desperate and stained with grease, hardened his resolve. He could not let an innocent man rot in a cell in Strathbane simply because the truth was uncomfortable. He drove slowly toward the manse, the imposing Victorian house that sat on a hill overlooking the village, much like Mrs. Wellington herself oversaw the morals of the community. The lights were on, casting long yellow rectangles onto the wet lawn. Hamish parked the Land Rover out of sight, down the lane, and walked the rest of the way, the gravel crunching softly under his boots. He needed to be the bumbling village copper now, the man who was more interested in a warm fire than forensic science. He rang the bell, shivering deliberately as the door opened. Mrs. Wellington stood there, framed by the warmth of the hallway. She looked composed, her silver hair perfectly set, wearing a thick cardigan of sensible grey wool. There was no sign of the panic that had consumed Jenny Campbell, only a steely resolve that Hamish found far more chilling. "Hamish," she said, her voice steady, "you look soaked to the bone. Come in. The minister is in his study preparing the sermon, but I have just put the kettle on." "That is music to my ears, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, stepping into the hallway and allowing Luggs to shake a spray of water onto the pristine rug. "I am sorry to disturb you so late, but I thought you would want to know the news about the murder." She led him into the sitting room, a space cluttered with needlepoint cushions and porcelain figurines. She poured him a cup of tea, her hand steady as a rock. "The news?" she asked, handing him the cup. "I heard the police had arrested that dreadful poacher, Maclean. Is it true?" "Aye," Hamish sighed, sinking into the sofa and wrapping his hands around the hot china. "DCI Blair has him in custody. He is convinced it is an open and shut case," says Archie threatened vein, "and that is enough for a conviction." Mrs. Wellington took a sip of her own tea, her eyes fixing on Hamish over the rim. "It is a tragedy, of course, but perhaps it is for the best. Violence begets violence." "Mr. Maclean has always been a troubled soul. That is what Blair says," Hamish nodded, slurping his tea loudly. "He is very happy. He has packed up the crime scene team and sent them all back to the city. He says there is no need to waste money on overtime when the killer is already in a cell." He watched her closely. There was a subtle relaxing of her shoulders, a tiny exhale of breath that she quickly masked with a cough. She thought she was safe. The police had their man, the investigation was over, and her Christmas Eve service was secure. "However," Hamish continued, staring into the depths of his tea as if reading leaves, "I am a bit worried, Mrs. Wellington. Being the local bobby, I have to tidy up the loose ends, you see. And I made a bit of a blunder." "A blunder, Hamish?" Her voice sharpened slightly. "Aye. You see, when I was at the hall earlier, before Blair arrived, I found something on the floor near the piano. A button, a small pearl button. It must have popped off during the struggle." Mrs. Wellington went very still. Her hand moved instinctively to her cardigan, then stopped. "A button?" she repeated, her voice tight. "Yes," Hamish said, scratching his head. "I picked it up, intending to bag it. But then Blair started shouting, and I got flustered. I put it on the edge of the piano keys, thinking I would pick it up later. And then, well, with all the excitement about Archie, I forgot it." He looked up at her, his hazel eyes wide and guileless. "I am worried, Mrs. Wellington. If the cleaner finds it in the morning, she might throw it away. Or worse, she might give it to Blair, and he will shout at me for leaving evidence behind. It creates a terrible amount of paperwork, losing evidence. Ideally, you should go and retrieve it," Mrs. Wellington said, her voice sounding strained. "Immediately." I know," Hamish groaned, standing up and stretching. "But I am so tired. And hungry. I was thinking I might just go home, have a pot of stew and nip down to the hall later tonight, around midnight. The hall is unlocked, after all. No one goes in there at night." He saw the calculation in her eyes. Midnight. He was giving her a window. He was telling her exactly where the incriminating evidence was, sitting on the piano keys, and telling her that the police had abandoned the scene. "That sounds sensible, Hamish," she said, rising to show him out. "You must look after yourself. The police work can wait for a full stomach." "You are too kind, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, placing his cap on his head. "I will see you at the service, I hope. If Blair releases the hall in time." "Nothing will stop the service, Hamish," she said, and for a second the mask slipped, revealing the fanatical fire beneath. "Nothing." Hamish walked back to the Land Rover, driving away slowly until he was out of sight of the manse. Then he killed the headlights and turned down a farm track that led to the back of the village hall. He didn't go home for stew. Instead, he parked silently, left Luggs to guard the car, and slipped into the darkened hall through the rear fire exit. The hall was freezing, smelling of dust and the lingering metallic scent of dried blood. Hamish moved like a shadow, positioning himself behind the heavy velvet curtains of the stage just a few feet from the piano, There was no button, of course. He had invented it, but guilt was a powerful architect. It would build the button in her mind until it was the only thing she could see. He checked his watch. It was barely 8 o'clock. He settled in for a long wait, the silence of the hall wrapping around him. He knew she would come. She had to. Not to kill again, he hoped, but to scrub the final blemish from her perfect world. Hamish Macbeth closed his eyes and listened to the wind, waiting for the sound of a sinner's footsteps on the floorboards. The silence in the village hall was of a quality found only in the Scottish Highlands, a deep, heavy stillness that seemed to press against the eardrums, amplified by the relentless drumming of the rain on the corrugated iron roof. Hamish Macbeth shifted his weight from one foot to the other behind the heavy velvet drapes, trying to ignore the cramp seizing his left calf. His stomach gave a traitorous rumble, a hollow protest against the mist stew, and he pressed a hand firmly against his midriff to silence it. Time stretched. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint, watery grey light filtering through the high windows from the street lamps outside. Hamish closed his eyes, visualising the scene. He thought of Archie MacLean in a cold cell in Strathbane, likely shouting at the walls. He thought of Jenny Campbell, terrified and broken, and he thought of the woman he was waiting for, a woman who baked scones for the church fete and organised the flower rota with military precision. It was a peculiar tragedy of village life, Hamish mused, that the desire for respectability could sometimes twist itself into a motive for the most desperate of sins. Then he heard it, the faint snick of the side door latch being lifted. It was a careful sound, practiced and slow. A draught of freezing air swept across the floorboards, eddying around Hamish's ankles, carrying the scent of wet tarmac and ozone. He held his breath, willing his heart to slow its rhythm. Footsteps, soft, rubber-soled, squeaking slightly on the polished wood. A beam of white light cut through the gloom, dancing frantically like a trapped moth. It swept over the rows of empty chairs, over the dust motes swirling in the air, and finally settled on the grand piano. The figure behind the light moved with a frantic urgency. Hamish watched through the slit in the curtains as Mrs. Wellington marched toward the stage. She was wearing a heavy waterproof mackintosh, the hood pulled up, but her face was illuminated by the backwash of the torch. It was a face set in a grimace of concentration, the eyes darting, the mouth a thin, hard line. She reached the piano and began to scour the keys. Her gloved hands swept over the ivories, patting the wood, searching for the non-existent pearl button. She dropped to her knees, the torch beam raking the floorboards, desperate to find the piece of evidence that Hamish had conjured out of thin air. "It is not there, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said softly. The reaction was immediate. Mrs. Wellington gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like tearing fabric. She spun around, the torch beam blinding Hamish as he stepped out from behind the curtain. He shielded his eyes with one hand, the other resting calmly at his side. "Hamish," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear but with fury. You are here?" "I am," Hamish said, his voice sad. "There was no button. I had to know if you would come to look for it. An innocent woman would have stayed home with her husband and her tea. Only someone who knew exactly where the struggle took place would come out on a night like this to clean a crime scene." She lowered the torch, leaving them in a semi-darkness that felt more intimate and far more dangerous. She stood up slowly, her breathing ragged. "You tricked me, you lied to me, and you killed a man," Hamish countered gently. "You struck him down with that music stand because he threatened your choir." "He was evil," she hissed, the facade of the respectable minister's wife crumbling to reveal the fierce protective fanatic beneath. "You don't understand, Hamish. He wasn't just going to ruin the concert. He was going to stand up in the house of God on Christmas Eve and spew filth about Jenny. He was going to humiliate us all. He was going to taint the service." "So you silenced him," Hamish said, with the sheet music, a permanent silence. "I went to reason with him," she said, her voice gaining strength, a horrible conviction taking hold. "I told him this was a holy place. I told him to leave Jenny alone. He laughed at me. He called me a provincial harridan. He said he would make sure the whole village knew what kind of girl she was." She looked at the heavy iron music stand, still standing where the police had left it, the chalk outline of the body fading on the floor. "I didn't think, I had to stop the noise. I had to stop the filth coming out of his mouth." "I understand," Hamish said, taking a step forward. "But murder is not the way to protect a church service, Mrs. Wellington. You have let Archie MacLean take the blame. That is not Christian charity. Archie is a poacher, a ne'er-do-well, she cried, backing away until she bumped against the piano. He would have gone to prison eventually anyway. But the choir needs me. The village needs me. She looked at Hamish, and he saw the shift in her eyes, the realization that he wasn't just Hamish the village bobby who liked a quiet life. He was the law, and he was the only thing standing between her and the ruin of everything she had built. I cannot let you take me, Hamish, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I have the service to prepare. Her hand shot out, grabbing the heavy iron music stand. With a strength born of desperation, she swung it up, aiming for Hamish's head. Hamish didn't reach for his truncheon. He didn't shout. He moved with the fluid, unexpected speed that always surprised those who mistook his laziness for slowness. He ducked under the swinging iron, the metal whistling harmlessly through the air where his head had been a fraction of. A second before. As she stumbled from the momentum, he stepped in close, grabbing her wrist and the shaft of the stand. No, Mrs. Wellington, he said firmly, wrestling the heavy object from her grip. The singing is over. She fought him then, a messy, undignified struggle of flailing arms and sobbing breaths. She clawed at his face, kicking at his shins, all the while muttering about the flowers and the hymns. But Hamish held fast, wrapping his long arms around her, pinning her arms to her sides until the fight drained out of her, leaving her sagging against him, weeping uncontrollably. It's over, Hamish whispered into the damp wool of her hood, feeling no triumph, only a profound weariness. It's over now. The adrenaline that had fueled Hamish's reflexes drained away as quickly as the rain running down the windows, leaving him feeling cold, hollow, and infinitely weary. He guided Mrs. Wellington to one of the folding chairs she had set out with such care only hours before. She sank into it, her face burying itself in her hands, a small broken figure amidst the vast, dusty emptiness of the hall. The iron music stand lay on the floor, a dark relic of a moment of madness that had destroyed 2 lives, the arrogant conductor's, and now the respectable minister's wife's. Hamish stood over her for a moment, lugs pressing a comforting nose against his hand. He felt no triumph in the capture, only the familiar melancholic resignation that came with peeling back the layers of village life to reveal the rot underneath. He walked to the payphone in the vestibule, fished a 10-pence piece from his pocket, and dialed the number for the Tommel Castle Hotel, where he knew DCI Blair would be holding court in the bar. Tommel Castle, Mr. Johnson's voice answered, sounding strained. Put me through to Chief Inspector Blair, Hamish said, his voice flat. Tell him it is an emergency. Tell him the case is cracked. 10 minutes later, the double doors of the hall swung open. Again. This time, however, the entrance lacked the earlier theatricality. DCI Blair, smelling strongly of single malt whiskey and stale cigar smoke, stormed in, followed by a bewildered Sergeant Anderson. Blair stopped dead when he saw the tableau, Mrs. Wellington weeping softly in the chair, and Hamish Macbeth leaning against the wall, looking for all the world like a man who had just woken up from a nap. "What is this, Macbeth?" Blair barked, his eyes darting from the woman to the constable. "I was in the middle of a toast to the efficiency of the Strathbane police force. This had better be good." "It is, sir," Hamish said, pushing himself off the wall and adopting his most subservient slump. "I am terribly sorry to disturb your evening. I only came back to the hall to check the heating. I thought I might have left it on, and I didn't want to waste the council's money." He paused, letting the lie settle. It painted him as penny-pinching and petty, exactly how Blair liked to see him. "And?" Blair prompted, impatient. "And I found Mrs. Wellington here." Hamish gestured vaguely. "She was in a terrible state, sir. It seems the guilt was too much for her. She thought you were coming for her next." Blair blinked, his befuddled brain trying to process the shift in narrative. "Coming for her? But we have the poacher." "Ah, but that was your brilliance, sir," Hamish said, stepping closer and lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "By arresting Archie MacLean so quickly, so publicly, you lulled the real killer into a false sense of security. But at the same time, the sheer force of your presence in the village, it terrified her. She knew it was only a matter of time before a detective of your caliber saw through the deception." Hamish watched the emotions play across Blair's flushed face. Confusion, skepticism, and finally, a blooming, arrogant realization. It was a bait Hamish had used a dozen times before, and Blair, starved for glory and blinded by ego, swallowed it whole every single time. "I see," Blair said, puffing out his chest and straightening his tie. "Yes. I suppose my interrogation of the poacher did send a shockwave through the community. I intended to shake the trees, Macbeth. Shake the trees and see what falls out." "Exactly, sir." Hamish nodded vigorously. "And she fell out. She confessed everything to me, thinking I was you in the dark. She told me about the music stand, the threats to the choir, everything. It was a crime of passion, sir, driven by your pressure." Blair marched over to Mrs. Wellington, who looked up with tear-filled, terrified eyes. To her, the red-faced policeman looming over her was the embodiment of the judgment she had feared. "Mrs. Wellington," Blair intoned, pulling a notebook from his pocket with a flourish. "I am Detective Chief Inspector Blair. I understand you wish to make a statement regarding the death of Sir Crispin Vane." "I did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to, but he was going to ruin everything. He was a devil." "Right, Anderson." Blair snapped his fingers. "Read her rights. Get her in the car. We'll take her to Strathbane tonight. I want the statement formalised before the press gets wind of this. This is a major coup." As Anderson gently lifted the sobbing woman from the chair, Blair turned back to Hamish. A rare, greasy smile plastered onto his face. "Not bad, Macbeth," Blair grunted, which from him was high praise. "You stumbled into it, of course, prowling around checking heaters like a janitor, but you held her until we arrived. I'll make a note of your assistance in the report. Somewhere near the bottom." "Thank you, sir," Hamish said, widening his eyes innocently. "And what about Archie MacLean? He is still in the cell." "MacLean?" Waved a dismissive hand. "Cut him loose. Tell him he was a suspect in an ongoing investigation, and he's lucky I don't charge him with wasting police time. He can walk home." "I will see to it, sir," Hamish said. He watched as Blair ushered his prize out into the rain, the DCI already composing the headlines in his head. "Top detective cracks choir killer case." The flashing blue lights of the police cruiser painted the wet walls of the village hall for a brief moment before fading into the night, taking the noise, the anger, and the tragedy away with them. Hamish was left alone in the silence. He let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders slumping. The credit was gone, taken by a man who couldn't find a haystack in a barn. But Hamish still had his job, he had his village, and most importantly, he had avoided the dreaded promotion to the city. He looked down at Lugs. "Come on, boy," Hamish murmured, switching off the lights and plunging the hall back into darkness. "It is time to get Archie, and then, I think, it is finally time for that pot of stew." 2 days later, the storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving the sky over Lochdu a bruised purple that slowly lightened into a crisp, freezing blue. The mountains stood stark and white-capped against the horizon, looking innocent, as if they hadn't spent the last 48 hours trying to drown the village. Inside the police station, the pot-bellied stove was roaring, emitting a heat that made the air shimmer. Hamish Macbeth sat with his feet up on the desk, a mug of coffee in one hand and a copy of the Strathbane Herald in the other. Lugs was snoring contentedly on the rug, dreaming of rabbits that were slow enough to catch. The headline on page 3 screamed, "Master Sleuth silences the singing killer." Below it was a grainy photograph of Detective Chief Inspector Blair, looking stern and pointing accusingly at nothing in particular. The article detailed how Blair's steely intuition and relentless forensic pressure had cracked Mrs. Wellington's composure, leading to a dramatic confession. There was a brief, single sentence at the very bottom. "Local police assisted in the inquiry." "Listen to this, Lugs," Hamish read aloud, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Chief Inspector Blair stated that he sensed the darkness in the suspect's soul from the moment he arrived in Lochdu. The only thing he sensed was the smell of whiskey at the hotel bar." Lugs twitched an ear but didn't open his eyes. The station door opened without knocking, and Archie MacLean shuffled in. He looked rougher than usual, which was saying something, but his hands were scrubbed clean of the axle grease. He carried the lingering scent of prison soap and righteous indignation. "I've come for my wrench," Archie grunted, refusing to look Hamish in the eye. "And to tell you that your dog is spoiled. I went to the cottage and he wouldn't eat the scraps I left." "Lugs has a refined palate, Archie," Hamish said, lowering the paper. "I trust the hospitality in Strathbane was up to your standards?" "It was cold, the tea was like dishwater, and the blankets scratched. Archie complained. He paused, shuffling his feet. But I suppose it was better than a life sentence. Mrs. Patel told me you tricked the old biddy, said you planted a fake clue. I have no idea what you are talking about, Hamish said innocently. Mrs. Wellington's conscience simply got the better of her. Archie snorted. He picked up his wrench from the corner where Hamish had retrieved it. Well, don't expect a thank you. It's your job to keep innocent men out of jail. Go and poach a salmon, Archie, Hamish sighed. The water is high, the fish will be running. I might just do that, Archie muttered, and with a final nod that was as close to gratitude as he would ever get, he slipped out the door. That evening, Christmas Eve, the air was sharp enough to cut glass. The village hall, now stripped of police tape and the chalk outlines scrubbed away, was filled with the warm glow of candlelight. The entire village had turned out for the service. It was partially out of tradition, but mostly out of curiosity. Whodunit loved a scandal, but it loved the resolution of one even more. Hamish stood at the very back, near the door, hat in his hand. At the front, the choir stood in their robes. There was a gap where Mrs. Wellington usually stood, conducting with terrified precision. Tonight, the schoolteacher was waving the baton. Then Jenny Campbell stepped forward. She looked different. The fear that had hunched her shoulders was gone. She stood tall, her pale face illuminated by the candles. When she opened her mouth to sing the solo of In the Bleak Midwinter, the sound was pure, crystalline, and hauntingly beautiful. It rose to the rafters, filling the space where Sir Crispin Vane had died, washing away the memory of his cruelty and the violence that had followed. Hamish felt a presence beside him. He smelled the faint, expensive scent of Chanel No. 5 before he saw her. She has a wonderful voice, Priscilla Halberton Smythe whispered. Vane was a fool. He was a man who couldn't bear to see things he couldn't control, Hamish murmured. And Mrs. Wellington was a woman who couldn't bear to lose control. It is a dangerous thing, Priscilla, the need for perfection. Priscilla looked at him sideways. In the soft light, his red hair looked less like a mop and more like burnished copper. And you, Hamish? You don't need perfection? I have a warm stove, a pot of coffee, and a dog who doesn't judge me. Hamish smiled, his eyes drifting to the door. And I have Whodunit. That is close enough. Blair is taking full credit, she noted. My father says he's being considered for a commendation. Good, Hamish said fervently. Let him have the medals, let him have the fame. As long as he stays in Strathbane and leaves me in peace, he can claim he wrestled the Loch Ness monster. The hymn ended, and the silence that followed was not the heavy, fearful silence of the murder investigation, but a peaceable, contented hush. Hamish slipped out before the lights came up. He didn't want to answer questions. He didn't want to be slapped on the back. He walked back along the waterfront, the reflection of the moon dancing on the black water of the loch. The wind had dropped, and the only sound was the gentle lap of the waves and the click of Lug's claws on the pavement. He reached the police station and locked the door behind him, shutting out the world. He moved to the stove, where a pot of stew, venison courtesy of a friend who looked remarkably like Archie MacLean, was bubbling gently. He poured a bowl, tore off a chunk of crusty bread, and sat back in his armchair. The phone on his desk began to ring. It was a shrill, demanding sound, likely headquarters wanting a report on the missing sheep dip forms. Hamish looked at the phone. He looked at the stew. He looked at Lug's. Let it ring, Lugs, Hamish said, blowing on a spoonful of gravy. It is Christmas Eve, and besides, the reception in the Highlands is notoriously unreliable. He took a bite of the stew, sighed with deep satisfaction, and closed his eyes. The mystery was solved, the village was safe, and Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he wanted to be, nowhere important, doing absolutely nothing.